Welcome to episode 4 of the Project Flux podcast. Today, we're joined by Andrew Knight from RICS, exploring the transformative power of AI in construction, from sustainability efforts to cutting-edge pre-construction technologies. Let's delve into the future of building, augmented with AI.
Hello everyone and welcome to episode 4 of the Project Flux podcast. It's been another week and another load of stories in the world of AI in project delivery. It never seems to die down and we've got loads to talk about again today. Before I get into the episodes again, please do subscribe, hit the follow button, and if you can, please leave a review because it really helps get this podcast in front of more and more people. And of course, this is the companion piece to our Project Flux newsletter. So the link to that will be in the show notes for those who don't already subscribe. And with that, you'll get the newsletters delivered to your inbox every Monday morning and then the podcast every Wednesday. So that's kind of the preamble out of the way. And we're going to, first of all, get into a little interview and a bit of a discussion with our fantastic guest today. We're very lucky to have Andrew Knight from the RICS. We really are thrilled to have you with us, Andrew. Andrew's a veteran at the RICS with 13 years of experience. I believe you began your career in IT with mainframes, and it's evolved alongside major technological shifts to now lead AI, data and tech throughout the leadership of RICS, which is the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. In his current role, Andrew drives the adoption of the RICS data standard and innovations in cloud computing, IoT and blockchain. So you're doing an awful lot there, Andrew. And you also have a rich history of liaising with the finance and investment community. I wonder how you fit that all in.
Well, I suppose that's what happens when you've been somewhere for 13 years. You get the benefit of doing a number of different roles. And, I think that there is a huge benefit there because, as you know, the built and natural environment is a hugely wide-ranging, practice area. We've got over 20 different pathways for people to come in and get qualified at RICS. And one of the benefits about having moved around RICS is gaining that knowledge and that expertise by being out there in the market and talking to all the different kind of practitioners, both here in the UK and globally as well. So it's been a very enriching 13 years to have worked in all those different sectors. And as you said in your preamble, I'm old enough to remember things called punch cards, which I'm sure most of the listening and viewing audience will have no idea what we're talking about when it comes to punch cards and languages like Fortran.
Maybe we'll come to that later because I think it's quite important to actually realise that this is, this technology, even though it's quite advanced now, it had to start somewhere. But I think your point about the RICS, for those who don't know the RICS, because I'm a member of the RICS myself, and it's as I said before, it's the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. And I think a lot of people who aren't surveyors, get these images conjured up of surveyors coming around to sort of measure your house. But it's huge, isn't it? There's a heck of a lot more to surveying than...
Well, it is. And what I normally do, particularly when I go out and speak to audiences who perhaps aren't familiar with RICS, or as you say, perhaps have an understandably perhaps narrow view because of their interaction with one kind of practice area, is that our members are working right across that whole kind of land, property, infrastructure life cycle. So, and whilst they work with architects, that's probably the only kind of specialism that they don't get involved in is that kind of architectural, civil engineering, structural piece. They're working on planning and development, land use. They're working obviously on construction, project management. They're working on brokerage, valuation, asset management, building surveying, building operation. It is an incredibly wide-ranging profession.
Yeah, absolutely. And in that, I mean, we touched on it in your bio, but tell us a little bit about your role at the RICS and how that kind of brings it all together under the data and AI.
Yeah, I mean, my role is very much an outward-looking one in the sense that I'm ready to say I'm not responsible for our internal systems in that way, but I sit within our thought leadership and analytics unit now. Prior to that, I was in our standards team, and we're very kind of related to that whole issue. But my role is a very privileged one, which is to look at this whole broad landscape of AI, data, and technology as it affects the built and natural environment. Work with various firms to gain insight into what's going on in the sector, and then reflect that information and knowledge back to the profession to help it really kind of take advantage, but also kind of manage some of the the risks that do come out of data and technology, because clearly with AI specifically, there are some things we need to manage there to make sure that we make sure that AI, in my view, augments what our professionals do, but doesn't replace them, and that we still have that kind of professional skepticism and reasoned advice. So it's a real privilege to do this role now, A, because so much is happening, and B, because it is out there to make sure that we help the profession. And bear in mind that many of our members are working in smaller firms. They're not working for the large firms that necessarily have the R&D and that kind of expertise. So we need to make sure that we democratize data and tech and AI and make sure that the profession takes advantage, but also manages some of those risks as well.
Yeah, it's a good point. The RICS is there for all surveyors, including one-man bands and SMEs. And I think the whole landscape of data and AI can be quite daunting. Obviously, to big companies, they've got the resources to pump some investment into it and explore it. But the smaller companies, it must be quite daunting. And I think what the RICS is doing is very, very important. RICS has been around for a long time, of course, and has seen lots of changes throughout its time. But do you get the sense things are moving faster now?
I think so, yes, in the sense that obviously there have been waves of technology in the past. I mean, I've seen many of them in the years I've been in the kind of the more general kind of data and tech sector, and we've clearly had waves of technology that certainly has helped with productivity. That's certainly given us a number of tools in which we do things, in hopefully a more productive and a more efficient way. I think what's fundamentally different about AI is this fact that it is replacing to a degree, or augmenting to a degree, the kind of decision-making processes and the way that actually we deliver advice and output, whether that's early cost advice or a project schedule or a evaluation. That there is this issue that AI now actually has produced, I think, a step change in what technology is now able to do. So this is not a case of the word processor or the spreadsheet, where I think we were still very much in control and using them as a tool. This is now a set of approaches and methodologies and models that is, I think, perhaps working in parallel with us rather than being something that we very much control. And so there is that danger, plus the opportunity of making sure that this decision-making capability works hand in hand with professionals. So I think this is a different evolution. There's always a danger in thinking that this is different, that this is a game changer. But I think it is different in some quite profound ways.
Yeah, and you said that word again, which we've had on the podcast a few times, augment, which I really like, because I think that's less scary than automate. Automate gives impression of things being replaced, but I think actually we need professionals more than ever with AI, because you still need somebody to actually make sense of some of the decisions that the AI churns out and make sure that they're correct. So I do like that word that you used, augment, because it does make you feel that you've got some control and that we still need that professional judgment as part of what AI brings
I
us.
think very much so, and I think particularly when I think there's probably a spectrum here where if you look more broadly at AI, not just in the built and natural environment, but broadly across the whole of society and the way it interacts with individuals and organizations, because one can argue that there are probably some very low risk applications of AI where perhaps if you have a clever algorithm that's optimizing your HVAC, then you can probably be quite content that you don't have to worry too much about the inner workings, as long as you're seeing cost savings, as long as people are sitting there in the right temperature. But if you're offering that kind of reasoned advice, as I said, maybe it's a piece of initial early cost advice, or whether it's a more detailed scheduling plan for a construction project, or as I say, evaluation, there is that real key human in the loop, to use the jargon, to make sure that what AI is suggesting is actually the most effective, the most appropriate option. And indeed, there's a level of, and I'm not sure this is technically in the dictionary yet, but this concept of explainability, how did we come to that decision? And I think also because, as you both know, AI is so dependent on the data that's used to train and run the models. We've got to be really, really, I think, as a profession, grasping the opportunity to kind of curate and make sure the data that's used to train and run these models is of the right stuff, the right scope, there aren't biases. So I think, ironically,
Yes.
because let's be honest, AI is not perfect. I mean, that's become very much to the fore with things like ChatGPT and these other generative tools, where people can see that there are errors, that the information is not 100% correct. I think as we realise that AI is both incredibly powerful but also fallible, we do need that human on the loop. And particularly as we go up that risk curve, where it becomes more important, the impact on individuals and the organizations becomes more impactful. We've got to have those human in the loop. And it's not that the human in the loop should start to put biases back into a very well-designed model, but we do need that kind of professional skepticism and reasoned advice to make sure clients get the best advice.
So Andy, just a question for me then. How would you mitigate human bias when you're curating or feeding the model?
Well, I think what you need, I think so much for me is almost that, and I use this phrase sometimes, is that everything's changing, but nothing's changing. I think we still need this sense of diverse teams, making sure that we understand where bias might be, that when we look at data sets, in a similar way that if we looked at a data set that was given to us on a spreadsheet, we need to think, well, where did this data come from? Is it a sensible data set in terms of scope and methodology and recency and all those kind of issues? And I think, bias is clearly a big problem, both in terms of where bias might affect individuals from a demographic, social perspective, but also just the reality of if we're looking at benchmark data and say, well, actually, have we only got projects from a certain part of either a jurisdiction or a certain kind of asset type, or that there's some bias there? And I think it's down once again to the expertise of domain specialists. And I guess this is another opportunity, I think, where the profession should grasp AI, is that no offense to sort of technical data scientists, but if they don't have the domain expertise of the built environment, they won't know what these biases might be. You may have some very clever data scientists who can write Python with their eyes shut, although I probably wouldn't recommend that. But without that domain expertise, they won't know what is good or bad data. So I think there's a huge opportunity once again for the profession to work with data scientists to say, okay, yes, you're the people who can write these very clever models, but I can give you that insight on the nuances, the idiosyncrasies, the challenges around the data sets. Because let's face it, as you know, AI thrives on big quality data, and dare I say it, the built and natural environment is not necessarily full of good quality data at the moment.
No, it's not. And the thing is, it's a churn, isn't it? Because even if it was, the data is only useful up to a certain
few recency
years,
issue,
4 years maybe tops,
well, I think,
and then you've got to keep topping it up, haven't you?
Well, this is a big risk as well, right? Because the larger the data set which is feeding the AI, the less risk there is of overfitting. Whereas when there's small amounts of data, you can overfit the data that you have to provide a certain prediction. But within our industry, is that the data isn't very good, which means there's more risk of overfitting and getting inaccurate responses.
Exactly, and I say that's why I think the built environment professionals have such a key role, because AI is perfect, and depending on the kind of use case and the context, it may in fact not be an appropriate tool at all. There may be situations where we say, no, actually, the right decision for this particular model is not to build it. And as you say, also, it is a moving target. I'm very much of the view that AI models are organic to the extent that you can't just build and deploy. You've got to be constantly thinking, well, do I need to recalibrate? Is the data set changing? Are we getting other variables coming in? There is a danger in people perceiving that you build these things and that's a done deal, when it's quite the reverse. You may do that initial set of training iterations, but you've now got this organic beast where you're going to get other variables coming in. The actual context of the data set may change. So it's that ongoing governance as well that's a key issue, to make sure that they still deliver appropriate results.
Well, it's a commitment, isn't it? Once you start deploying one of these tools, you have to maintain it. You have to make sure the data set is kept up. So you have to keep checking it, because as you say, it's never perfect.
Yeah.
And if you can get to 99% perfect, you're doing well. But then there's still always the chance. And you talk about bias. Just before we go into the next section, I mean, but people kind of think of bias as something that's intentional, but of course, the bias can be totally unintentional as well. So you've got to keep reviewing the data set to make sure something hasn't kind of crept in, and you've got this kind of best fit line that assumes loads of variables that aren't actually true. So it's what I say, it's a huge commitment. And actually, once you've deployed an AI tool, whatever it may, whether it's a third party one and one you built yourself, there is a commitment there to make sure that it's still doing the job. Because just because it's hitting all the right levels now, maybe in a month's time it won't be, because it's moving so fast. So
exactly.
But before we go, because we've got a few big news stories, and it will touch on some of these themes, actually, some news stories we're going to talk about. Can you just let people know where they can find, because I've been lucky enough to be on your podcast, Andrew, and I know you do some great publications. Where can people find those resources?
Yeah, fairly simple. I mean, it's as simple as just Googling our ICS Tech Partner Program, and they'll get to the links on rics.org. We have a blog there with a mix of articles and video discussions, as we recorded one a couple of weeks ago, James. So yeah, if you just Google our ICS Tech Partner Program, and it will come up, and you can look at the blog, and I say it's a mix of video discussions and articles and content like that.
Brilliant. I thoroughly recommend it. There's some great guests on Andrew's show, so definitely check that out, and we'll put that in the show notes as well for people to download. Brilliant. That's a fantastic introduction, Andrew. We're going to move to some stories again, and so, like I say, some of them do touch on what we were talking about, and there's a few specifically around construction, and there's a few around the wider kind of tech world, which is moving faster and faster. The first one I wanted to touch on was from a publication called For Construction Pros, and it talks around AI powering the construction industry, boosting efficiency. And there's a lot of these articles that come out that kind of make it sound like AI is this magic pill that's going to sort of help everything. But there's a few things that really caught my eye in this particular article that I thought worth discussing. So one of them, I'll just read a quote, said, some are hoping that advancing technology can help their companies meet their increasing sustainability goals. And I thought that's quite interesting because, a lot of companies are trying to work out how they're going to meet these quite hard to hit sustainability goals. And what this article was suggesting is that one way of helping companies get there is by utilizing AI. Do you think that's a reality? Do you think AI
I think it's probably on the cusp of a reality. I mean, if we get at the risk of getting quite granular, I mean, if you think particularly now where we have, as you know better than I do, classically, delivering projects has been about time and cost and functionality, if I can use that phrase, delivering what was on the original spec. And I guess we now have to add another piece to that triangle and turn it into a square, which is the whole carbon sustainability piece. So you're looking at adding another sort of tension to that historical triangle of making sure that you can deliver all three. And I guess that is a real challenge now. And I think where AI, can begin to bring some value there is that kind of optioneering of saying, well, what are the compromises? What are the things I can actually optimize when I'm looking at those four things now? Because I clearly have a spec to deliver. I need to deliver it on time. I need to deliver it on cost. But I have this other variable now of embodied and the implications of operational carbon and design life. And we're going to end up with a situation where often I think AI can be very helpful, where it goes beyond the number crunching ability of us as humans to think, well, how can I look at all those options? Can you now do effectively a Monte Carlo and give me, what are the options here? What are the sensitivities where actually, yes, you probably could do it, but it might take a month of Sundays to do that manually with a spreadsheet. So I think that's where AI can begin to look at all those particular options and give us, once again, perhaps a set of options that we can take to a client and say, look, these are the levers we can pull. There's some compromises here. There's some trade-offs between cost and carbon and time and specification, and have those kind of intelligent conversations, but do it in a way that hopefully a lot of that groundwork and that data analytics has been done by AI rather than the human beings. And the human beings can then sit in a room and look at those options and look at those kind of parametric design choices.
Yeah, because I guess, projects that go wrong, it's usually because decisions have been made at the outset.
Yeah.
Too quickly, or they're not all the information. You haven't looked at all the options. So I think the opportunity is, like you say, allowing AI to look at all the different options. And sometimes there's compromises. You talked about that square. Actually, there may be one point on that square that has to give, or one point on that triangle that has to give. But it's around making informed decisions, knowing that actually you're going to let the costs actually increase slightly because it's going to help you meet your sustainability goals, or vice versa. So I see what you mean. It's I take these things with a pinch of salt sometimes because the articles make it sound like it's, like I say, it's this magic pill that's going to solve all the problems. It won't solve the problems.
No,
but it might help you make better decisions, I think.
Yeah, I think another area where and it's, to some extent, this is quite generic. It's not just construction, and it's not just the sustainability piece, but in terms of general efficiency, is one of. I often think that there's a slight positive circularity to the comment I often make about the poor quality of data that we have in the built environment. And obviously, AI can actually be a tool to help turn all that unstructured data into more structured data as well, and to summarize documents. So I think in a general kind of an efficiency, or it might even be just pulling in EPDs and turning them into more structured information, back to the sustainability piece, that AI, I think, does have that potential now to help us sort out one of the fundamental problems we have as a sector, which is we haven't got good data to drive AI, but we can use AI to help us curate the data. So it sounds like a slightly kind of circular argument, but it's almost like there's a sort of prerequisite step here where we can use AI to get our data into a better sort of curated state. And indeed, as you know, the whole area of document management, where you think of the whole issue around contract management and variations, and dare I say it, the disputes that can arise, AI, I think, can play a very useful role there in terms of document management, summarizing, data mining, that kind of thing as well. So I think there's quite prosaic things that AI can be very good at, because there's always a danger that we leap straight to Terminator 2 and think of all the kind of, very kind of sort of sci-fi versions of AI. But I think one of the real things we need to think is that AI is very good at the mundane, repetitive tasks.
Yeah.
And actually, some of those aren't terribly exciting, whether it's taking meeting notes or summarizing documents, or those kind of things, which actually can be very unproductive for humans to do. So it's almost let's use AI for some of those kind of quite low-level tasks, rather than thinking we're going to, save not so much save the planet, that's the wrong phrase to use, because that's what we want to do, but sometimes it's those really kind of prosaic things that AI is really good at doing, repetitive tasks where actually that will drive a lot of efficiency.
Yeah. As my old boss used to say, that the grunt work, he used to call it, which is
it's a slightly pejorative phrase, but it is. And let's face it, I mean, there's a well-trodden statistics that even data scientists spend 60-70% of their time just kind of massaging the data and trying to get the data into a good shape before they can do any analytics. So it's those initial stages of tidying data up, turning documents into data, analyzing data at the most basic level that AI is very good at.
Yeah, because there's this misconception, isn't there, that people say, oh, we haven't got data in the construction industry. That's not strictly true. The data's there. It's just not standardized. It's just kind of lumped into some kind of file somewhere, totally unstructured. That's the problem. The data's there. It's just like you say. So that's the opportunity, which is real, and it's getting real all the time. Turning our attention to it's the same publication actually, but another article which talks around the impact of it. We're very familiar now with this generative AI that ChatGPT, conjures up images of ChatGPT and Gemini, but it talks about the impact of parametric AI, and I think in some ways parametric has been kind of forgotten. It's not the trendy thing to talk about at the moment. But I don't know, Yoshi or Andrew, how could you explain the difference between parametric and generative AI?
Well, I mean, parametric, I think, as you say, it's quite a well-used term. And I think if you think back to kind of the design phase, that's something as fundamental as saying, look, if I make this pillar 2 times bigger, what's my bill of quants look like? What do the work breakdown look like? So I think there's a very fundamental value of this parametric concept of what can I change? And if I change, what is the effect further down the line in terms of time, cost, and now ultimately carbon as well? So I think this sense of what parametrics do is giving at that very early stage, which you mentioned before, James, when one can either get things wrong or right, is that flexibility to flex a design, flex a project, and say, well, what's the implication of that? How much more concrete, how how many more rebars do I need? What does that mean for the work breakdown structures? And I think it'd be quite nice also to highlight not only the kind of parametric in terms of cost, but I know with one tech partner I've worked in where they're taking a kind of an optioneering parametric effect to the whole work breakdown schedule concept of saying, well, actually, how many cranes do we need? And if we flex the number of cranes, how many more steel workers do we need, given we're using it to put the steel in? And if we change the team sizes, what does that mean about overtime or productivity? And this idea of kind of optioneering those work breakdown schedules and saying, well, actually, we're building a fairly complex project here. Perhaps it's infrastructure or just a large piece of real estate. How do we tweak those parametric options of plant, machinery, labor, materials? And what's that optimum thing? Once again, back to that triangle or that square, what if we did pay overtime? Could we then deliver it a month early and save on other factors that we were paying for while the site was open? Or indeed, if we bring more cranes in, how many cranes can that site absorb? And if so, what does that mean for the size of labour and other bits of the plant that we need to support it, or indeed the deliveries of materials?
That happens all the time, doesn't it? This kind of acceleration, but it's done on gut feel. I think the parametric AI is going to, going back to what we said before, allow people to make informed decisions and actually with some basis, rather than just saying gut feel. Yeah, let's chuck some more money at this project and hope it.
An example that this particular client, this particular firm mentioned to me was that a firm had done exactly what I described. They bought some more cranes in, but they didn't bring in the labour to go with it, so they had idle cranes. It sounds like an obvious mistake, but we're all human. And they tweaked something and thought, well, let's throw some plant at this, but not thought through the downstream of, well, what else do we need? What steel do we need to arrive earlier? How many more people do we need?
Yeah. So you're going to make a point, I think.
No, I was going to say, well, some of this technology without the use of AI has existed. So it's like when you go and buy a car, right? And you have these configuration tools where you configure the car and it will give you a certain cost depending on the customizations you put onto the car. So in this instance, with parametric AI, it's predicting the outcome when you change some of these weightings. And I think in the article, it mentions large tract residential developments. So you have a lot of space with standardized homes and people want to customize parts of their homes. There's software which automatically feeds the flow of data to then give you an indication of what the cost impact is from some of these nuances in the configuration. So I think it's an interesting point. But James, it's something that we do similarly at Gleeds, right, with Alex Bill's benchmarking tool with parametric cost modeling. Is you look at certain parts of the project, you can amend certain parts, and it will give you insight into project outcome.
Well, I guess benchmarking is parametric in its very nature, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think the parametric AI just lets you do lots of configurations automatically, effectively.
And I think also some parametrics are more kind of subtle than others. I mean, I know, for example, if you look at the models that the BCIS use for rebuild costs, as you know, you could make a building bigger, but that doesn't double the cost, because yes, you've got more steel, but you haven't got any taller walls if you've just merely made the floor space bigger. So some of the parametric things, as you mentioned, Yoshi, configuring a car is a relatively straightforward bill of material type kind of parametric. But as you know, if you think of the design of a complex structure, some of the parametric adjustments you make won't give you that kind of linear adjustment in terms of some of the other costs and those kind of aspects. I think that where AI scores is this ability to understand the way certain of these models will flex in a way that's non-linear, that is just much more subtle than saying, well, I want alloy wheels, therefore that's an extra $50 or whatever, because that's a pretty kind of sort of linear type kind of choose from a list and there's a price list. So your point's well made. I think people understand the concept of that kind of parametric flexing, but it's where you get these more complex built environment situations where you've got many more variables and these interdependencies and these non-linear relationships.
Yeah, but I think it's perfect for the construction industry, and in some ways, even though generative AI is extremely exciting, this parametric AI is probably more practical for a lot of people. Certainly, if you're a designer, it's something you can use straight away. It's being built into a lot of the design software, I guess. So it's a practical application that you can use right away.
So just a question: is parametric AI then supportive of more creative designs, or is it negatively impacting more creative designs?
I mean, for me, I think it would be supportive. I mean, I was thinking of an example where I know a firm that uses a degree of AI in doing, takeoff of quantities, and what they've been doing is, particularly where you get unusually shaped elements in a design, that's where this kind of parametric AI is very useful, because it's back to that kind of method of measurement. Oh, okay, well, yes, you've designed this particular slab or this particular column, but actually, given the parametric way you're changing the shape and the dimensions, really, what are my material requirements based on that? Where it's not a simple quantity takeoff. So I think once again, it's very well suited to the built environment where you're not necessarily getting widgets off a shelf to build. You're having to kind of build custom elements in that respect. And so I think it's a much more powerful tool in this context than, perhaps the simple examples, as I say, of car configuration, or in the days when you configure your your desktop computer from Dell and decided what sort of disk you want in it. It's a much more kind of subtle thing, as you well know, that people will look at a model, a BIM model, and say, well, yes, we can't quite build it that way because it's not quite as simple as just drawing those objects and then those turning directly into a bill of quants.
And there's so many dependencies, aren't there? If you change one thing, it changes 5 other things. And
exactly, it's that dependency piece of okay, well, you've done that, so that now implies X, Y, Z.
But do you think it will continue to, this parametric AI will continue to evolve? And how do you think that might, impact the construction industry? Do you think?
I think it will probably hopefully get better and better, and I think that's a general theme I think we're seeing with AI, that a lot of things come out and are X% effective, and then it's then that marginal gain of, okay, how do we make that a little bit more? But I think once again there will always be that human oversight, because there will always be edge cases where these things will get it perhaps either wrong or arguably spectacularly wrong, because they've just simply gone beyond that edge case, that level of confidence. So I think once again they will get better and better, and they'll reach probably a point where they probably reach that point where it'll be very, very small gains beyond it, but there'll still be that gap piece where we still need and I always go back to the adage, and it's one of my concerns about AI, is that we don't lose that kind of fundamental knowledge within the sector, that, if you don't know how to do something from first principles, how can you judge the output of an AI model? So what I don't want to see the profession do is lose that fundamental first principle type knowledge. So when they look at the output of some model, they can think, that doesn't look right.
Yeah, that's the worst case scenario. And it's the thing that I have been very, very worried about, because if that happens, then you're effectively handing over control of our industry to software companies, because the only people who will actually know how things work are the software companies who will own the algorithms. So it is a real concern. If I was to name the number one concern around AI for us, and not just this industry, I think there's many industries exactly the same. It's that we sleepwalk into a scenario where we no longer have control over how things work.
Exactly, and I think that's why the profession must embrace AI, because it's happening, and the best way to stay relevant is to make the data scientists understand how critical it is that we have the domain expertise, because to the risk of pushing the car analogy too far, we're not like the manufacturing sector. Yes, we have elements of off-site, we have elements of components, but as you know better than I do, every project is almost bespoke to some degree, whether it's the groundworks or, yes, there's modular elements, but, almost everything is kind of bespoke each time. And therefore, it is very idiosyncratic in terms of the risks, in terms of the building pathology that different countries use. So, it really isn't a one size fits all. It's not like having, a small number of car manufacturers and then the tiers of suppliers underneath it. It's a very different kind of, and once again, the relationship of all the tiers of the supply chain as well. It's a much more complex environment than the controlled environment of aerospace or the motor industry, for example. And so I think from that point of view, the human being, I remain optimistic, will always be very, very important with AI in the built environment, but we must embrace it and almost make the sector realize that actually that domain knowledge will remain critical.
Yeah, I think it is probably the reason why the industry slightly sometimes lags behind other industries is because it is complex, it's difficult, and it takes time for us to kind of catch up. But that's fantastic. Good discussion there. I just want to move to a couple of other stories.
Yeah, sure.
We did mention last week we knew that the Meta large language model Llama 3 was about to be released, and that now has hit. Although we can't get it yet in the UK, I believe. I think Meta AI.
I tried it yesterday, and it wouldn't let me because I was in the wrong country.
But it's quite interesting because it looks like this is quite a leap forward now in terms of the actual technology. It seems to be, for an open source model, it seems to be up there with ChatGPT, but the trust and the safety tools within it are quite interesting. And I think it's significant because it's an open source model, so it's going to drive innovation and collaboration. Yoshi, I know you've had your eyes close on this. Well, what do you think about?
I mean, it's the best open model at the moment, right? I mean, it's outperforming open models. It's outperformed Claude Sonnet, Mistral Medium, GPT 3.5, and obviously its previous form of Meta Llama 2. One thing I quite liked about it from Meta's perspective is their big emphasis on open source ethos.
Yeah.
To the point where they have a responsible use guide. So they've amended their responsible use guide to factor in kind of a community development, and they're building products using LLMs. I mean, it's only 27 pages, but it gives you indications of use cases, preparing the data, training models, performance evaluation. So I think that step is a big pull when you're looking at alternatives which are more proprietary. And it's focused on the developer, puts the developer in the driving seat. But also, I mean, the ability to pull this into kind of your local drives is key for a lot of industries, right? Because 100% privacy, data doesn't leave your machine, the speed in which it works, the latency on local drives because you're not having to send to the cloud, offline availability. And with some of these things, they're cost effective long term as well.
Yeah.
And the ability to customize business requirements. It's something that's really interested me. And I've seen a lot of kind of communities and organizations looking to how to implement Llama 3 within different UIs and UXs. So it's a very interesting one.
Yeah, and
no,
companies...
and you raise that very important about that kind of on premises, if we can use that phrase, because I think a lot of people have woken up, and I think whilst there's clearly been a hype cycle around the whole kind of generative, AI piece and large language models. I think what has been very useful has been the catalyst, I think, for the whole sector to kind of wake up and realise that AI, although it's been around for a long time, this has really kind of made the mainstream aware. And I think also people have quite quickly realised that actually they've got to start thinking very, very much about sort of commercial sensitivity and privacy. And it's all very well loading all your leases into a large language model, but that needs to be pretty well controlled. And even to the extent I was talking to some participants where they picked up pretty quickly that even if they had an internal LLM, they have information barriers as well internally. So you've got to be thinking, well, even within an organisation, we can't just let this stuff flow around unchecked. So I think it's been a really useful catalyst to make people think, how do we do this responsibly? How do we actually make sure that there's a degree of explainability, that we have got some kind of understanding of what it's been trained on, that there's proper curated content that's going into this. So I think it's been a really, and I suppose that does emphasize how quickly this is, even the generative AI debate has moved from, what was it, late 2022. We're already now relatively mature in the sense that people are realizing, yes, it's powerful, it does have limitations, how you implement it is important, these kind of privacy and trust issues. So it's matured, I think, in a good way really, really quickly. And I guess you've seen not so much creative destruction here, but a lot of good competition with, you say, Mistral and Llama and OpenAI and the models that are out there that are hopefully driving what will be a better outcome in terms of how we do use generative AI.
Yeah, I'm so glad there's somebody like someone like Meta. It's ironic, isn't it? Meta, who are the ones who had all the controversy about privacy, are now the good guys, right? Creating the model that they're giving away that's secure. But it's important because it's going to make OpenAI and Anthropic and Google up their game as well. Because
I think everybody will react, and that's why competition is so good. I don't think we want anybody to end up with a monopoly of any of these tools. We need competition because there will be risks and challenges, and it means the vendors will need to continue to address those risks and challenges for the benefit of the market. And I think whilst there's to a certain extent a kind of vacuum obviously around formal guardrails and standards, I think we're hopefully going to evolve quite quickly to what good looks like when it comes to both the effect on consumers and the risks to corporates.
Just looking forward to getting my hands on it. Hopefully they'll make it available in the UK soon.
I'd say it was ironic. I got an email saying here it is, and then I tried it and it wouldn't let me use it.
I know. It's not fair, is it? But maybe one of our American listeners can let us know how they find it.
I don't know whether you just crank up your VPN and pretend to be in a different country. I didn't say that.
Yeah, that's
that's what you could do. Yeah,
that's my homework for tomorrow. Just a couple other quick stories before we wrap up. There was another one around this in the newsletter around companies. I think there's a company called PhotoBucket who was an image hosting site. Looking in talks to kind of sell their billions of photos to generative AI models. And it raised this whole question around people selling data. I mean, we've heard it a few times because these generative AI models rely on data. But, there seems to be this kind of movement happening where people are selling data. The other one that came out was Suno, which was a music AI generated thing. And it's unclear about what that's trained on. It must be trained on commercial music, because if you
Yes.
put in a prompt to ask it to create music like Elvis Presley, it sounds like Elvis
But
Presley. So
we've
what
seen
do you
this
think
though.
about?
I think,
Well,
James,
I mean,
sorry. No, go
sorry,
on,
Yoshi,
Andrew.
you were going to.
There you go.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, that this has been a sort of issue that's been bubbling under ever since ChatGPT, arrived on the scene, and I don't think we have clarity yet. My understanding is that there are a number of legal cases already extant that are still working their way through the system based on just the kind of text scraping that ChatGPT was doing, and I think it is one of the areas where not only our sector, but more generally, we're going to have to go back to the old-fashioned things of copyright and IP and understanding. Actually, yes, we might have some data, but are we allowed to use it for a certain purpose, or indeed is it our data in the first place? And as you know, AI and particularly large language models like to gobble up data. But I think the danger is that some of that may have been gobbled up in a way that actually has infringed copyright. So I don't think we know the answer to this story yet, but I think it would be interesting, and I think it would be counterintuitive if there wasn't some kind of legal case law that comes out of this that means actually no, you can't simply just sell data that you might be holding for this kind of use.
Yeah, and I think
no, carry on, James.
Yeah, I think a lot of them, they know what they're doing because it's vague at the moment. They see it as an opportunity. Well, I'm going to gobble up as much as I can now whilst it's vague before these come in, because it's going to be the ones that kind of get there first and, corner the market, as it were, that are going to thrive for decades probably. So I think there's a lot of companies out there doing this knowing that it's a bit vague. So I take the Mid-Journeys and the music ones and some of the large language models. I think they know exactly what they're doing, and they're just saying, well, it's vague at the moment, so I'm going to take the opportunity.
I suppose the irony, because data in the built and natural environment is fairly siloed and unshared and fairly opaque. Ironically, it's less of an issue in the short term, I guess, for our sector, because our data isn't flowing around and shared broadly in the public domain. But as you say, these more socially impactful things, maybe the genie's out of the bottle to that extent. But I don't think we've heard the last of this kind of legal issue, whether there may be any retrospective damages that might well come out of these things. I mean, I say, I think there are certainly a number of court cases that OpenAI, I think, are liable potentially for around this kind of copyright.
I think was it OpenAI or was it Google who said that basically said that if you suffer a court case or a lawsuit because using our solution, we will cover your legal fees. I think it was OpenAI, which I found that astounding.
Yeah, I mean, there was one case that I did hear of, and I think it was, I forget the source, and I think it was actually, interestingly enough, it was actually the Microsoft Copilot on GitHub, where I think somebody's code on GitHub had obviously been then used by Copilot to suggest some other code, and although the code was on GitHub, clearly it was still copyright protected, and I think the copyright owner, I think, did sue or sought damages from another firm, which had clearly, in its view, breached the copyright of its code. So
it's extremely complicated, isn't it?
It is extremely complicated, but as ever, people want to protect their IP, and ironically, if it was code that was on GitHub, it still may have been protected by license, even though it was in the public domain. But they still were exercising their right. So, I think once again we clearly haven't heard the last of this whole issue of copyright and the ability to use data for a purpose. And I think that's another thing the profession will need to be mindful of, is that yes, if they're loading data into an internal large language model, then they do need to be mindful of where it's come from, both in terms of quality and provenance, and also whether, I know, perhaps in the setting of a valuation or some kind of cost advice, can they use some data that they've actually accessed that was in the public domain for that purpose?
Yeah, and I think that's the lesson with this, is that it's so unclear. All this is still emerging, and anyone who's got project data, just be ultra cautious, be careful, especially when it comes to anything which is sensitive.
Yeah,
because it's not clear at the moment. So we're not saying absolutely experiment with this stuff, but I think it all goes back to common sense. Experiment with this stuff, but don't use confidential or data that. And I think the rule of thumb, Andrew, is if in doubt, don't
Yes.
upload a large language model. That's my mantra. If anything, if your spider senses are saying should I, then don't. Not yet, anyway.
Yeah, I think you can use duck typing, as they say in the IT world. It walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and looks like a duck. It's probably a duck. So yeah, I think the gut feel can go a long way in terms of common sense of thinking, and similarly with the kind of all ethical questions of where you use AI, particularly where it's affecting private individuals. I think it's not hard. I think hopefully for most of us to think where the lines are in terms of the ethical use of this, particularly I say when it's in high risk decision making situations where it's affecting private individuals, particularly.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fantastic. We could talk all night, but we are drawing to the end of the episode. And there's plenty more news, as I said, within the newsletter. We've literally covered just a fraction of what's going on. But just before we close, any final words from you, Yoshi?
No, nothing from me.
Andrew, thank you so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure. I hope you can join us again in the future.
Love to, yeah.
Any sort of last parting words from you?
For me, I think it would be really just re-emphasising, hopefully what I've hammered home a few times is, for those listening and who are working in the built and natural environment, we need to embrace this technology. We need to be curious. We can't spend an entire day job looking at it, but we need to be curious, learn about it, experiment in an ethical, responsible way. But we've got to roll our sleeves up, understand what it can do, what it can't do. Because often the best decision will be, well, no, perhaps AI won't be any use in this context. But we really do need to roll our sleeves up and get involved and get curious.
Absolutely. So yeah, on that note, I think we'll draw it to a close. Please, everyone, follow in the show notes. Follow Andrew. He's very active on LinkedIn. Posts great content. Follow his podcasts, and we'll be back again next week for another edition of Project Flux. In the meantime, have a great week, everyone. See you soon.